just as it was in the days of Noah. It was the same in the days of Lot. It will be just like that on the day the Son of Man is revealed. That's how Jesus described the end times in Luke 17. And in that same passage, he gives a very curious command. Remember Lot's wife. Now look, I actually have a Lot and Lot's wife salt and pepper shaker set. It's cute until you realize one of them is a literal pillar of salt. Bit of a tragic dinner conversation starter. But Jesus wasn't telling us to remember Lot's wife because it makes for fun dinner hardware. He was warning us that these ancient events still have something to say about today and the future. And today, we're going to be exploring Genesis 19 with fresh eyes, bringing together archaeology, geography, rabbinic tradition, and New Testament connections so you can see just how deep this chapter really goes. Here's where we're headed. We'll start with the biggest question. Did this event actually take place? Should we view the narrative of Sodom and Gomorrah as a literal historic narrative or just as a mythical cautionary tale? Then we'll unpack what the actual sin of Sodom was. It might surprise you what the Bible actually has to say about this subject. And we'll see why 2 angels were sent to investigate. As a hint, it wasn't just random. We'll look at Lot's wife and what Jesus actually wants us to remember about her. And finally, we'll close with a striking parallel between Lot after Sodom and Noah after the flood. An odd and terrible pattern that seems to repeat again and again after destruction narratives. So buckle up. Genesis 19 is about a lot more than just fire and brimstone. Let's start with a question that often comes up. Is there any evidence that Sodom actually existed? Now, here's the thing. Archaeology has proposed a number of different sites over the years, but none of them are universally accepted. Back in the 70s and 80s, the sites of Bab Edra and Numera on the southern side of the Dead Sea seemed like promising candidates, but they aren't exactly in the locations that the Bible describes. And later archaeology seems to dispute some of the earlier claims of their destruction dates. Then in 2021, there was Tel al-Hammam on the northern side of the Dead Sea that was said to have been destroyed by a cosmic airburst. They described melted pottery, shocked quartz, and human remains being dismembered by a blast hotter than the sun. However, that paper was brought under a lot of scrutiny, and finally it was retracted in 2025 after some of the data was deemed to be falsified. So instead of arguing about the excavation layers, we can learn a lot by looking at what ancient historians and geographers said about this region. 2 key voices, Strabo and Josephus. Strabo was a Greek geographer writing in the early 1st century AD. In his major work, called Geography, he describes the area around the Dead Sea, what the Bible calls the Salt Sea, as a land scarred by fire and disaster. There are indeed many evidences still remaining of the catastrophe which befell the cities, and even the land itself is full of salt and barren. The flames issuing from the ground and the odor of smoke, even to this day. Strabo is writing nearly 2,000 years after Genesis 19, and yet he says that the land still remembers, with visible destruction and uninhabitable ground. From Strabo's perspective, the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah were historic events that still had lasting effects on the land itself. Likewise, the Jewish historian Josephus, writing around 75 AD, affirms that the area was seen as a permanent memorial of divine judgment. In his book, The Jewish War, he says the country of Sodom remains even now as a witness to the wrath of God. It is burnt up and bears nothing but ashes. And again, in Antiquities of the Jews, he writes, the traces of the 5 cities are still to be seen, for the smoke continues to arise from the ground, and the region smells of brimstone. Notice that both of these writers are saying visible ruins, barren land, sulfurous smells, and ongoing smoke. They believe that the landscape itself bore testimony to the truth of the biblical narrative. And here's what's fascinating. The geography of Genesis 19 matches the descriptions of the region that Strabo and Josephus report. Genesis 19:28 says, Abraham looked down and saw the smoke rising from the land like smoke from a furnace. Genesis 13:10 describes the plain of the Jordan as lush before the judgment. The Dead Sea region is still one of the most barren, salty, and lifeless places on Earth, rich in bitumen, sulfur, and unstable geographical features. Even today, visitors see salt formations along its shores, and the surrounding landscape is pockmarked with sinkholes, reminders of a land forever altered. So, do we have an exact GPS coordinate that says, "Welcome to Sodom"? No, but that's okay. What we do have is something perhaps even more powerful. We have geography that fits the biblical story, historical memory of a catastrophic destruction, ancient reports from respected Greek and Jewish historians, and a land that even now looks like a place marked by judgment. And that's where we begin our journey in Genesis 19, with a landscape that quite literally remembers what happened there. But what did happen there? Let's talk about the sin of Sodom. Because if your only takeaway is they were sexually immoral, you're missing most of the story. The Bible actually gives a multifaceted indictment on the people of Sodom. First, Ezekiel 16:49 and 50 say, "Now this was the iniquity of your sister Sodom. She and her daughters were arrogant, overfed, and unconcerned. They did not help the poor and needy. They were haughty and committed abominations before me. Therefore, I have removed them, as you have seen." Pride, gluttony, neglect of the vulnerable. Sodom institutionalized cruelty. We need to realize that the sexual sin wasn't the only problem in Sodom. Not caring for those less fortunate is a big deal in God's eyes. We get a glimpse of how they treat visitors in Genesis 19, and Ezekiel lets us know that it is not an isolated incident. To be clear, Jude 7 adds the sexual dimension. In like manner, Sodom and Gomorrah indulged in sexual immorality and pursued strange flesh. We cannot overlook the perverse sexual practices of Sodom. When we read, "All the men of the city of Sodom, both young and old, surrounded the house. They called to Lot, saying, 'Where are the men who came to you tonight? Send them out to us so that we can have relations with them.'" We should be alarmed. The homosexual rape of visitors is certainly a problem in the city, but I might argue that that is a symptom of a deeper heart issue described in Ezekiel. And rabbinic tradition agrees with this deeper problem in Sodom. Yes, the sexual sin is a major problem, but the treatment of strangers and the lack of hospitality is highlighted by the rabbinic teachings. In Sanhedrin 109b, we read stories of Sodom outlawing hospitality and generosity, punishing anyone who helped a stranger. There's one story about a young girl who gave bread to a poor person, and when the authorities found out, they smeared her with honey, placed her on the city wall so that bees would sting her to death. This story illustrates the extent to which acts of mercy were criminalized in Sodom. The city was not only immoral, it had institutionalized hatred of generosity. This wasn't just about personal sin, it was about a systemic culture of injustice. This needs to be viewed in contrast to the extreme acts of hospitality that Abraham shows in Genesis 18. If you haven't seen it yet, go back and watch our video in Genesis 18 to see how we're supposed to treat others. In Genesis 18, God says the outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah is great because their sin is so grievous. I will go down to see if their actions fully justify the outcry that has reached me. If not, I will find out. And 2 men turned away and went towards Sodom. Why did 2 of them go to Sodom? Why not just 1? Why not 10? Or why not a whole host of angels? Why does God need to go investigate at all? Doesn't he already know what's happening there? Well, I think God explains it in Deuteronomy 17. In verse 6, we read, "On the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses, a man shall be put to death, but he shall not be executed on the testimony of a single witness." The death penalty can only be enacted on the testimony of 2 witnesses. And rabbinic law clarified that these had to be eyewitnesses, not just hearsay. These witnesses had to actually see the crime being committed in order to enact the death penalty. Now, that doesn't mean that they couldn't penalize a person for a crime they didn't have 2 eyewitnesses. They just couldn't put them to death. This was certainly an effort to make sure that justice was just. So, what's so interesting here in Genesis 19 is that God wasn't about to enact a death sentence on an entire city without following his own standards of justice. God's justice is always just. When the 2 angels arrive in Genesis 19, they're acting as divinely appointed witnesses. Only after they experience the city's violence firsthand does judgment fall. The same principle echoes in Revelation 11, where 2 witnesses prophesy before the end. And I will appoint my 2 witnesses, and they will prophesy for 1,260 days, clothed in sackcloth. Even in the last days, God sends his 2 witnesses to call the people to repentance. The people will try to harm them, just like they did in Sodom, but they will be unable to. Instead, these witnesses will shut the sky so that no rain will fall. Sounds a lot like Elijah. And will turn the waters into blood and strike the earth with every kind of plague. Sounds a lot like Moses. While these 2 witnesses in Revelation are not explicitly named, Moses and Elijah are the 2 guys that appear with Jesus on the Mount of Transfiguration, so I'm not saying it's going to be them, but I'm just saying that Moses and the prophets are pretty important witnesses before the last days. We need to remember that God is just. He gives warnings. He sends witnesses. No one can say they weren't told. Not even Lot's wife. Now, what about Lot's wife? Why does Jesus tell us to remember her? In Luke 17, Jesus is warning about the end times and tells us to remember Lot's wife. So what should we remember about her? Well, the only place she's really mentioned is in Genesis 19, where we read, "But Lot's wife looked back behind him, and she became a pillar of salt." Lot's wife was with him when the angels came. She was with him when they tried to warn his family of the coming destruction. And she was with him when the angels dragged them out of Sodom. She was led to safety just like Lot and his 2 daughters. But she looked back to Sodom. Now, this wasn't just a matter of her looking back and seeing the destruction. No, Lot's wife looked back because her heart was still in Sodom. Her glance was not innocent curiosity. It was a regretful longing for what she was losing. Her home, her possessions, her old life in Sodom. It was a spiritual hesitation, a failure to trust that leaving was necessary and right. She wished she had stayed in Sodom. So God's judgment fell on her, even though she had physically left the city. Now, when we view Jesus' warning, it makes a whole lot more sense. Jesus says, "On that day, let no one on the housetop come down to retrieve his possessions. Likewise, let no one in the field return for anything he has left behind." Remember Lot's wife. Jesus explicitly connects Lot's wife's sin with the danger of being attached to your possessions, to your home, to your past life when God is bringing judgment. The warning is not about looking backwards physically. It's about having a divided heart in the moment when a clean break is required. In context, Jesus is warning his followers that in times of crisis, especially at the end of the age, you cannot hesitate. You can't long for the old world or your old stuff. You can't be halfway in and halfway out when the kingdom is moving forward. We all need to ask, am I fully ready to leave behind the world when God calls me to? Do I remember Lot's wife? Now, finally, let's zoom out a bit and notice a strange pattern in Genesis 19 that echoes back to Genesis 9. After Sodom's destruction, we have one of the more unsettling scenes in the Bible. Lot and his 2 daughters were preserved from the destruction and are living in a cave when one day the older daughter said to the younger, "Our father is old and there is no man in the land to sleep with us, as is the custom over all the earth. Come, let us get our father drunk with wine so we can sleep with him and preserve his line." And they do. Lot gets drunk on wine and ends up sleeping with both of his daughters, and they get pregnant. These sons lead to the Moabites and the Ammonites, 2 future enemies of Israel. Later in Deuteronomy, we find out that no Ammonite or Moabite or any of their descendants may enter the assembly of the Lord, even to the 10th generation. One might say that both of these people group end up being cursed as a result of the moral failings of their parents. So to summarize, Lot and his daughters survive the catastrophe, then get drunk and commit incest, leading to a cursed people group. Compare this to Noah after the flood. Noah plants a vineyard, gets drunk, and his son Ham saw his father's nakedness. When Noah awoke, he cursed Ham's son, Canaan. Now, this is a pretty difficult narrative to deal with because we aren't 100% sure of what is meant by saw his father's nakedness. Plus, it seems like Ham is the one who did something to Noah, so why curse his child? Well, there's plenty of different theories as to what happened. but I see a parallel connection here to Genesis 19. You see, in Leviticus 18:7, God says, "You must not expose the nakedness of your father by having sexual relations with your mother. She is your mother. You must not have sexual relations with her." The same term, your father's nakedness, is used here to describe having sexual relations with your mother. I posit, when Noah was drunk, Ham sleeps with his mother, gets her pregnant, and Canaan is the result of that union. This would run a perfect parallel to the post-catastrophe events of Sodom and Gomorrah. Noah and his sons survive the catastrophe, then get drunk and commit incest, leading to a cursed people group. I mean, it's not a nice story, but it seems to be a pattern that is followed almost exactly by Lot and his daughters. So why point out this pattern? Well, I do find it textually interesting, but more than that, I believe it teaches us that even though we may be saved from the catastrophe, we are still capable of moral failings. We are still capable of committing the worst sins we can imagine, even after God has delivered us. We should read these narratives and not think, wow, those people were horrible, but rather we should realize that we are all still sinners, even if God has delivered us. Because remember, Jesus told us these narratives matter for the days to come. Jesus specifically references the days of Noah and the days of Lot when describing the last days. So, as we look forward to the future, my prayer is that we heed these warnings and continue striving after the one who has delivered us. And hey, next time you see a Lot and Lot's wife salt and pepper shaker, maybe take a second and remember Lot's wife. It might just be the best reminder on the table.